Hello and welcome back to our live coverage from the United Nations Climate Change Talks here in Tianjin, China. I'm delighted to say that we've been joined by Liz Gallagher from E3G, and you're going to help explain why money is important when it comes to these talks. So maybe that's a good first question. Why is money important?
Well, the money is important because this is a global effort, so we need both the North and the South to participate in reducing emissions, and the South have also got to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So this is what the money is for. It's kind of a global effort, but it's from developed countries to pay for the kind of debt that they owe to developing countries for climate change.
Okay, so it's kind of reasonably clear why it's important, but how much are we talking? Is this kind of £1 million, or are we talking £1 billion even, or maybe even a little bit more?
Probably a little bit more, actually. There's loads and loads of different studies at the moment, and some range from the kind of hundreds of billions. There's one came out, I think, about a year ago from the International Energy Association that said we needed $3 trillion additional money by 2030, just in energy infrastructure alone, which is huge. So what we're trying to get is a smaller pot of public funds to help sort of catalyse and incentivise all the private sector investment in low carbon, sort of resilient action that we need to see on the ground. So there's lots of different scales being used, and there's no kind of one concrete answer, but it's definitely in the hundreds of billions.
I think something that helped me get my head around the kind of huge quantity of money that was necessary was hearing about the floods in Pakistan and the fact that it's going to cost $40 billion alone to recover from that. So when you think about the potential impacts of climate change, maybe that helps understand it. But I guess the next big question then is when do we have to, when do countries need this money, and when is it going to be sent to them?
Sure. Well, at the moment, countries should be receiving what they call fast start funding, which is a bit like the kind of short-term guinea pig style trialling different types of climate action. So they're receiving that up until 2012, and then the longer-term funding. So hopefully we'll get a longer-term mechanism that kicks in post-2012, which will look at kind of the bigger scale projects that we need to see to really transform to get us well below the 2 degree temperature rise.
Okay, and how much has been agreed so far?
So for the Fast Start funding, it's $30 billion, approaching $30 billion, it says in the Copenhagen Accord, and that's for the period for 2010 to 2012. And then the Copenhagen Accord also talked about $100 billion, and that's both public and private finance, which quite frankly is nowhere where we need. And that they said the $100 billion had to be by 2020. And obviously if the IEA is saying we need trillions by 2030, this is a different ratio. So we want to see a lot more kind of public funds, but really smart use of public funds. We're not naive. We understand this is the age of austerity, but really using those funds to really catalyse really good programmes that really build resilience on the ground and make communities and cities stronger and kind of ready for when climate change does eventually hit, but also to develop on a kind of really low carbon pathway so that we also reduce the possibility of climate change as well.
So we're talking big money. Even if we don't hit these trillions targets, we're still talking big money. Who's going to pay?
It's a very good question. This is one of the fights that's going on at the moment within the Advisory Group on Finance. So the Advisory Group on Finance was set up after the Copenhagen Accord by Ban Ki-moon, and he set up a group of politicians, financiers, investors, sort of very, very high level, to come together and to think about where the money was going to come from and who was going to pay it. So depending on, there's lots of different mechanisms out there that you can make money from, things from putting a levy on every time you fly to all sorts of, the financial transaction tax. Now, those have different implications depending on which mechanism for who would pay. So, for example, if you put a ticket levy on your airplane, that might impinge on some developing countries, but there are mechanisms to redress that, so we could make sure that developing countries got that money back, and that some of that also they'd kind of net profit really eventually in the end. So there's lots of talks, but obviously the UNFCCC is a very principled based discussion and kind of negotiation, and what we're trying to do is bring a little bit of pragmatism and a little bit of realism of what's actually happening in the outside world into these negotiations here.
Okay, so let's be optimistic and say that there's an agreement that does facilitate this transfer of money to the poorest and most vulnerable countries. If we're talking trillions or even just hundreds of billions of dollars each year, who's going to manage that? Like, how is this going to happen in practice?
Well, another key issue being negotiated at the moment is who will manage that. So there's lots of talk about setting up an independent fund. We also have an existing fund, the Global Environmental Facility, which probably isn't up to the scale and the speed and the largesse that we need it to be. There's also other institutions vying for this, so institutions like the World Bank. But essentially, who's going to deliver it? It's going to be the governments on the ground who are doing the work. And so I think it's really about these kind of conversations here about who will manage the funds. In essence, it should really be about what's the national plan, how are they integrating their entire development model, so how they're integrating poverty reduction alongside tackling climate change, how are they putting those two together, because at the end of the day that's what really, really matters, is actually seeing action on the ground. And we can have a kind of theoretical discussion here about World Bank versus independent UN fund, but at the end of the day we want to see the action on the ground, and it's about developing countries being ready and having the technical expertise, same as developed countries. The UK, for example, doesn't quite have the technical expertise. We've never done this before, so it really is a lesson learning kind of opportunity, and so we just need to make sure that it's at the national level that counts.
Okay, and just finally, then, the talks have been proceeding quite slowly this week, and I know that the discussions of finance are going on. But what's the kind of next big milestone that we should be looking for here is kind of the United Nations process?
Sure. Well, I think obviously there's two milestones. I think the advisory group on finance, so this Ban Ki-moon's kind of special, almost task force really, that's going to go and help us get some money, will be reporting in early November, and we're really hoping that they come up with something tangible and possible and feasible that can influence the negotiations, which is the next milestone in Cancun. So it's a bit unclear at the moment quite what will happen in Cancun. I've heard a lot of parties say that there won't be a kind of full, all singing, all dancing, comprehensive treaty. I think that's probably a given. But quite what the nature of those decisions and how far countries will get to be able to get to concrete decisions that really have an impact and really start to rebuild the confidence of this place is quite important.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Liz. It's a really clear kind of lowdown on the state of the climate finances. So I'll just say thanks for joining us, and I'll hand back to our UK studio.